This course is almost finished, but before we finish, I'd like to take the opportunity to give you a few sort of words from the coach. And these are by no means the truth or even something that you have to care about, but they are merely a few reflections that I've made throughout a large number of projects that I've been working with in R. And the first tip from me to you would be to use comments generously while writing scripts, because although they might seem clear enough when you write them, you will get back to them at a later time, perhaps when you get the comments from the reviewers or something like that, and then they may be very difficult to decipher, and the comments will be helpful to you. I also recommend that you use the name or state the names of the arguments when providing arguments to a function, because although you may save time and perhaps space by simply giving the values in an order separated by commas, it's rather difficult to understand what you are actually feeding into the function unless you state the names of the arguments. It's also useful to use line feeds within the script in order to separate chunks of code to make it easier to get a hold of what you're actually doing, to keep lines doing something in particular together and then another part of the code doing something else in a chunk by itself. When you have code that should only be executed in some occasions but not others, you can also use the number or comment sign in front of the code, so that if you by accident highlight all the code and run it, then these commands will not be executed. And I'll show that on the next slide. I also suggest that you, if possible, avoid to repeat almost identical pieces of code, at least if we're talking about large pieces of codes. For example, when you're doing subgroup analysis, it's better to load different subgroups into the same variable at different times and then use this single variable to analyze the data, and then you just change the contents of the variable. I'll show that too in the next slide. Here is an example of reusing code, and to use the number sign to avoid getting code run by accident. So we start here by reading some sort of raw data set into memory and putting it in D. And then I assign nothing to an object called D2, which is the one I will use to contain the data for my subgroup analysis. Next, we load data into D2, data concerning only the subgroup we're interested in. And as you can see, we have one subgroup per line here: diabetics, non-diabetics, men and women. And we have number signs in front of them. And then we have a large piece of code, it might go on below here, where we analyze D2. As you can see here, we use the D2 variable. So if you have loaded it with the diabetics, for example, by highlighting text from after the number sign until here, then the diabetics will be analyzed. And if you have loaded the non-diabetics, then the non-diabetics will be analyzed. So if you find that there is something wrong in the code here, you only have to change that once instead of in 4 places if you had copied the piece of code and put the diabetic selection or non-diabetic selection within the code itself. And by erasing D2 here and putting these number signs in front of all the D2s, you make sure that if you just run the code, D2 will contain nothing and you will get an error message here because it doesn't work. And then you will realize that you have to do something, that is to load the subgroup you're interested in. Another piece of advice is to avoid recursive code. For example, if you would like to log transform the dose, then I don't recommend that you write $dose equals log $dose. That is, that you put the logarithmized values in the old, or overwrite the old column. Because if you happen to run this piece of code twice, then you will logarithmize the logarithmized values, and you will end up with erroneous results. So it's better then to put the logarithmized dose into a column of its own and leave the dose, the non-transformed dose, in the old column. Because if you run this piece of code twice, you will not change anything, but you will just create this column once again. Another thing that is recommendable is to make changes to the raw data. If you have to make changes, for example, if you encounter errors, not to make the changes in the raw data file itself, but rather to load the raw data into the R script, and then in the R script make the changes that are necessary, because it may turn out that the error was no error after all, and then you will have difficulties to trace what you have actually changed. But if you make the changes within R instead of in the raw data file itself, then all the changes are documented and they are reversible. And you can also write comments as to why you made the changes. Since you don't normally see the names of the columns in R, I recommend that you use names that are sort of congruent so that they are easy to remember. For example, if you write $age with a small a, then it's not a good idea to write body weight with capital letters here, because it would be difficult to remember which ones were spelled with small letters and which one were with large capital letters. If you call something dose.mean, then this one should probably be dose.max, not max dose. And if you use point here, treatment duration, then study drug without the point is not a very good choice. And here we have mixed languages. Since I'm a Swede, I might give one column the name behandling, which means treatment, and then another one time. And this is something that I actually do a lot of the time, but it's not a very good thing to do. It's also important that you look at your data, since you don't see it right away. So generously use view, structure, head, tail, and all those commands to take a look at the data and make sure that the correct things are going into the functions. Otherwise, you may get very incorrect answers without realizing what you're doing. And you should always watch out for missing values. When you get odd error messages, it's often NAs that are involved. Finally, when you write R scripts, I recommend that you stick to some sort of structure that you're familiar with and that you have found works for you. And this is an example of the way I usually write my scripts, but you could all, of course, do it any which way you want. But it's a good thing to not change it completely for each script. I start here by loading the libraries and the packages that I need, and after that I load the data set or the data sets that I'm going to use. After that I usually correct any classes that are incorrect. For example, if I load the data with strings as factors set to false, then I may want to make some of these columns into factors anyway. Then I would correct any incorrect values that are in the raw data set. And after that, I may recode variables and create new variables that I will need in the analysis. After that, I create the subsets or pick the subgroups or whatever I'm going to analyze. And finally, I analyze and present the data, make all the graphics and so forth.